Hi again. This is lesson 8 for writing task 1 in the academic module for the IELTS exam. So this lesson is on multiple graphs. So there are question types where you have a question that has two different graphs, perhaps a pie chart and a line graph, a table and a line graph, a bar graph and a pie chart. Could be any combination of the different graphs that you've already gone over. I've only ever seen questions with two different graphs, so again, like a line graph and a table, not with more than two. It's possible you could get more than two, again, as long as you follow the same principles. Think while you're planning and organizing your essay. If that did happen, it shouldn't cause any particular problems. The overall amount of data that you would present would be approximately similar, and you could make adjustments to the number of body paragraphs if you had an extra graph in your question. But again, I've only ever seen two graphs in a question, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this lesson. And so if this is the first lesson that you've seen in the Task 1 course, lessons 4 and 5 on line graphs and pie charts, that's where the bulk of the information about how to deal with the different types of data is. And essentially referring to data that happens continuously over time, which happens at different points in time, or it refers to differences between categories and how that can those types of data can be presented in different types of graphs, pie charts, tables, bar graphs, etc. So if you haven't looked at those, have a look. And again, I would do this. This question type is very, very simple once you know how to respond appropriately to the type of information that is presented. And again, that information you can find in lessons 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we're going to have a look at a multiple graph question, and then we're going to specifically go over a different one, keeping those things from the previous lessons in mind. Okay, so here's our question. Let's see. The graph and table below give information about water use worldwide and water consumption in two different countries. So that is your introduction, right? So essentially, writing a multiple graphs report is like writing two mini reports in one. So you can have one sentence introducing it, describing both. You could have two. You could say the graph below shows information about global water use, and the table below shows water consumption in Brazil and Congo in the year 2000, something like that. So again, when you get a question type like this, you've got two different graphs, but you don't have to make comparisons between them. So again, they're related. So water use and then water consumption in these two different countries, they're on the same topic, but you don't need to make comparisons between them. So really the simplest thing to think about is, that's the way you introduce it. So your overview is also similar in that it kind of has two parts, and some people divide it into two different sentences. So, you're looking for the usual trends. Are we dealing with time or not? So global water use by sector, water consumption in Brazil and Congo in 2000. And if we look at, in terms of, increases, decreases, agriculture, increase, industrial use, increase, domestic use, increase, water consumption, let's look. So water consumption, I've just noticed that the graph that I've got does not include the category. So if I remember correctly, that's the population of the country. This is the amount of irrigated land, and this is water use per person. So if you think about what's happening here, so obviously the population is much bigger. How much bigger? It's about, 30 sometimes the size. The amount of irrigated land is much, much higher, even considering the population. So if you multiply 30 times 100, you get 3,000, 26,000. So that's much higher. And the use of water per capita per person is much, much higher in Brazil. So your overview is essentially two different parts describing global water use. So time is included here. So for a line graph, you're always dealing with time, 1900 to 2000. So over the period 1900 to 2000, water use for all sectors increased with, okay, that's the basic trend, increase. Now, one is much higher than the other, so we want to include that information, with the highest use being agricultural use throughout the period. We're also going to give some details about the differences between Brazil and the Democratic Republic of Congo. regarding water consumption, Brazil had significantly higher amounts of irrigated land and higher water consumption per person than the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Again, when we go into the details paragraph, we'll go into the details about this. That's the information for our overview. Again, in a multiple graph question, it's nearly always the case. I've never seen one where this wasn't true, where 4 paragraphs didn't work, and your first details paragraph was one of the graphs, and your second details paragraph was the other graph. So our first details paragraph is going to be about global water use by sector. And remember, we've got to use figures. So we describe the overall trend in our overview. So what's happening here? So we look at the time. Everything's increasing, but there seems to be a place where everything starts to increase a bit more sharply, and that is approximately here. For something like this, one paragraph, you could say something like, so for industrial, agricultural, and domestic use of water, there was a gradual increase in the first half of the 20th century, with agricultural use, for example, increasing from 500 cubic kilometers in 1900 to around 1,000 cubic kilometers in 1950. Industrial use, on the other hand, increased from around, industrial and domestic use increased minimally during the period, something like that. So you can't really see it. It's like around zero. So let's just call that minimal use. When you report data, it's always got to be accurate. Now, obviously, the numbers I gave here for 500 and 1,000, they're not exact. So that's why I use approximately, right? Here, it's really difficult to say. I mean, it looks like industrial use and domestic use started out around the same, which is around zero, but it's definitely not zero. So we're just going to call that minimal use during this period. And then in the second half of the 20th century, there was a sharper increase in water for all purposes. Agricultural, for example, increased from around 1,000 cubic kilometers in 1950 to around 3,000 in the year 2000. During the same time, water used for industrial and domestic purposes increased from very minimal to around 1,000 cubic kilometers for industrial use in 2000 and around, let's see, what can we say? What is that around? About 200 cubic kilometers for domestic use. I've gone into a little bit of detail here, more detail here, and I've given numbers for both sets. Again, if it's really difficult to see the numbers and give them, you don't need to. But using approximations is important, right? So this isn't zero. This isn't zero over here, but we don't really know. So again, using a word like minimal or very low, something like that is adequate. Remember, when you finish describing the graph, the person should have in their mind a reasonably clear picture of what happened in the graph or the information that's in the graph. So if we look at the chart, we've got population, that's this one. We've got irrigated land, so that's land that has water run into it for agricultural use, and we've got water use per capita, so per person. So what we notice is these numbers are higher for Brazil, for all of them. So you could say something like, considering water consumption in Brazil and Congo in 2000, Brazil had the higher population with 176 million people versus 5.2 million in the DRC. Water use was much higher per capita at 359 cubic meters versus 8 cubic meters in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And finally, irrigated land followed a similar trend with 26,500 square kilometers in Brazil versus 100 square kilometers in the DRC. So, the important information is that Brazil was significantly higher than the Democratic Republic of Congo in both irrigated land and water used per capita or per person, and then mentioning the populations. If you've done that, you've got all of the important information and you are ready to go. So if you look if you haven't seen the information under the lesson on the website IELTScompass.com, you can find information here, but there's more concise information about the structure and how you do that with 2 different types of graph. Okay, so this is the graph that we're going to look at, a specific example. The pie chart shows the main reasons for why agricultural land becomes less productive. The table shows how these causes affected 3 regions of the world during the 1990s. Okay, so it's in the past. And if we look at what we've got, causes of worldwide land degradation, other 7%, deforestation 30%, overcultivation 28%, overgrazing 35%. So again, these are words, deforestation, overcultivation, overgrazing. You should use those in your report. So in task 1 academic, in the graphs or especially in the diagrams and maps, things will be labeled. And in many cases, you don't need to find any synonyms for that. Just use the labels that they have because those will be clear. So if we look at the table, causes of land degradation by region. So this is worldwide. This is by region. So North America, Europe, Oceania. Total land degraded over here on the right. And then 3 types of degradation, as mentioned in the pie chart. So deforestation, overcultivation, overgrazing. So different numbers. So we've got, what is it, about 16 different numbers. And most likely, in this particular one, it will be easy to combine some of those numbers. If I remember correctly, this one in the Cambridge book, the sample answer written by an examiner uses, I believe, all of the data points and is not super, I think it's like over 200 words, but it's not ridiculously long. So again, this is kind of in the middle. If you know my approximately 8 to 12 useful pieces of information rule, then you'll know that we can combine some of these. So, okay, so remember, let's have a look. The pie chart depicts the global causes of land degradation, and the table shows these changes in 3 regions of the globe during the 1990s. So if you look at the wording of the question, you can see I've tried to vary that wording a bit. Again, you're not getting much of your score from your introduction. It's mostly in your overview and your details paragraph. So let's look at that. To sum up, overgrazing, overcultivation, and deforestation were responsible for nearly all of the loss of productivity in agricultural land worldwide. So if we look at this, 30%, 28%, 35%. Now you're often going to talk about like the highest one, the lowest one, etc. Except here, the highest one, 35, 28, they're all approximately the same. You know, they're very, very similar. And the only real different one is other. Since we don't know what that is, I just left that detail out of my overview. And basically I'm saying that the other ones, overgrazing, overcultivation, and deforestation, are responsible for nearly everything. So I'll go into percentages later, but that's the main point. Of the 3 continents presented, so North America, Europe, and Oceania, Europe accounted for the greatest proportion of degraded land. So again, if I go back and look at this, there's lots of stuff, but you know, the one that has the most degraded land is Europe. So you know, you'll often have this kind of highest, lowest, etc. We've got a lot of pieces of information to deal with here. So again, focusing on the big picture is what we want to do. I could possibly have said, of the 3 continents presented, Europe accounted for the greatest proportion of degraded land, and North America accounted for the least, something like that. But you know, we're going to go into detail about that later. And the information I've given, the 3 causes of nearly all of the worldwide land degradation and the place where most of it happens, that is good enough for a complete and clear overview. Again, for something like this, you've got a little bit of flexibility, but you would definitely need that information that I had in there. And you don't want, the danger when you start talking about the most and the least of everything is that you get an overview that's got too much stuff in it. And remember, your overview is just where you're explaining the big changes that happen, the most important information that kind of tells you what the point of the graphs is. And so for that, you will generally need a few pieces of information. If you have too many, then it's not going to be clear, you know, what's the difference between the details and the main important information. So that will be less clear the more information you put into your overview. So you want the correct amount of information in your overview to describe the main things happening in the graphs. How would I divide my details paragraph like the last one we just looked at? Again, 1 for the pie chart, 1 for the table. Now this one is going to be quite short because the information is, there's not very much information. Overgrazing, overcultivation, and deforestation represented 93% of the total land degradation of the world, with 35, 28, and 26% respectively. So if you're going to do what I have done, adding the numbers up, make sure you get your math correct. I will change this as soon as this lesson is over, but you'll notice overgrazing, overcultivation, and deforestation represented 93% of the total land degradation in the world. 35, 28, 30. That is 93%. But if you look at the numbers down here, 35, 28, 26, it doesn't add up to 93. That adds up to 89. I think what happened? I wrote 26 instead of 30. So this is why it's really important to look carefully. And that would be a problem if I wrote that in the real test, because that is not accurate. Now, it wouldn't be a huge problem if that's my only mistake. But again, consider how important, consider that it is important to get the numbers correct. And especially if you do something where you're adding things up, you've got to get the math correct. You generally don't need to do that. But if you do, be sure that you add it up correctly. Again, you're in exam, time pressure, could make mistakes. So other causes, anytime you have other as a category, you've got to put it in quotations. Other cause comprise the remainder. So if we want to do some more math, the remainder is 7%, as is stated here. So there you go. So if we look at, it's a short paragraph, but again, there's not a lot of information there. We go to examining the causes of land degradation by region. Europe had the highest total for degraded land at 23%, with the major causes being deforestation and overcultivation. So if we look at Europe here, deforestation is 9.8, overcultivation is 7.7, so that makes up most of it. So I've decided to focus on the main causes here, which is fine. North America, in contrast, showed only 5% of its land degraded, and the vast majority, 4.8%, was from overgrazing and overcultivation. So I've done some more math. Let's see how I did. 3.3, 1.5, that's 4.8. So again, that's the majority of it. I haven't mentioned deforestation because it's such a minor aspect. So remember, talk about all the categories, give figures, but you don't need to give every single figure for every single category. And there are some cases where you'll do that, but it's generally easier to do it than in this question, and it's more important that you do it because usually in cases like that, each piece of information is essential, whereas it's not really the case for this one. Finally, the figure for degraded land in Oceania was 13%, with the main cause being overgrazing at 11.3% of degraded land. So if we look here, again, I haven't mentioned these others because they're minimal in terms of how much they contributed to land degradation. Zero, there's a zero. Usually if there's a zero, that's worth mentioning, and that is the last sentence of my last details paragraph. Overcultivation was not a factor in Oceania's loss of productive land. The most important information, all there. We've got the trends described in our overview. We've got plenty of data described in numbers, and we've hit all of the important points so that we've given a clear picture of what the most important information is that's presented in these graphs. Below that one, you'll have another version with cohesive devices, referencing devices, less common useful vocabulary, highlighted, as with most task ones, green. You don't see many cohesive devices, just enough to keep everything clear. And again, referencing devices and less common vocabulary. Less common vocabulary is more about how to report data, things like that, and synonyms for geography. Referencing devices I've gone over in previous lessons, so if you're not sure about those, have a look at one of the previous lessons, but you can see it's basically just ways to refer to something that you have already mentioned. There's a couple of them here. So that's it for this one. So there you have a lesson on multiple graphs. So remember, a multiple graphs question is quite simple in that you're essentially just writing two mini reports, one on one graph and one on the other, in the same question. Again, have a look at the information underneath the video on IELTScompass.com and you'll see some information about how you divide that information up. But once you know how to describe data for the various types of graphs questions that you get, multiple graphs questions are quite simple. However, make sure you do get adequate practice with this question type also. Like everything else in IELTS, the more practice you do and the more different situations you expose yourself to, the better your chances will be on exam day. And that, of course, is what you want.